Welcome back to everyone who is listening and watching on YouTube. Today we have an interesting topic because we received a comment on one of our videos a couple of weeks ago, and I just want to actually read part of the comment because this person, she actually left a couple of questions for us, and I thought it'd be very interesting to actually discuss on the channel, and I think she actually wanted us to have a conversation about it. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the last part of her message or comment, which is quite long, and I really appreciated everything that she wrote. And it basically says, I personally love Korean culture, which I've experienced mostly through entertainment and casual research. It's a dream of mine to learn the language as much as I can at my age and visit Korea one day. Could you have a conversation about how a completely non-Korean can best navigate being an outsider when visiting or working in Korea? What can be done to improve one's acceptance, express genuine respect, and increase the likelihood of being embraced by the people? Not only do I want to know for myself, but I want to educate my students as they consider stepping outside of what is familiar in order to explore other nations, peoples, and our cultural differences and sameness. My students want so much to be accepted being African American from the Chicagoland area, and they desire to grow more as global citizens. I really, really love that question in so many ways, because it not only recognizes the desire to want to learn more about Korean culture, but also the desire to want to relate and also appreciate the differences between the cultures. So basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna break this comment down into two questions or two parts. The first part being, how can a completely non-Korean best navigate being an outsider when living, working, or visiting Korea? And then the second part, we're gonna essentially just, from our perspective, answer what's the best way for a complete foreigner or a non-Korean to be embraced by Korean people or accepted. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna attempt to answer that from our perspective and also from our experiences. And I just want to throw out a disclaimer that our answer isn't like the definitive right answer. Right. Again, it's just based off of what we think, our experiences, and also coming from the perspective of being foreigners, but also half Korean, and just, you know, having our understanding of the culture. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is just attempt to answer this question and have a conversation about it from our perspective.
Hey, I wonder if our students are actually going to watch this.
I hope so.
Yeah, you know, they're going to wheel out the old TV and hook up the computers to that, and then they'll watch us.
Wait, you had that growing up too?
I had that, and we would watch Bill Nye the Science Guy and
my gosh,
you know, National Geographic. Well, not National Geographic, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We did that, so maybe we are appearing to you now on your TV screen, students.
Right. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, but this is great because it's a way to sort of create a safe place to talk about cultures, differences, and sameness. And so I have a couple of things that I thought of in terms of maybe how to approach this question. I'm sure, Becky, you can think of a couple of things yourself. But I want to start out by saying this as the foundation when it comes to, like, if you're a complete non-Korean and you want to come to Korea to either live or work, which those two will probably have to go hand in hand, or you just want to visit, I think the starting point would be to understand that the society or the culture is completely different than your own. And what I mean by that is not only the language, but the way that generally Korean society or Korean people view life. There's a certain framework and perspective that Korean people have and view life and go throughout life with. The same way that us as Americans growing up in America, Americans, generally speaking, have a certain way of looking at life, a certain framework. And from that framework, that's how they communicate and relate to other people, right? America is known to be more of an individualistic society. And they really prize, they as in us, we really prize our individual freedoms, whereas a lot of Asian countries tend to be more collectivistic as a society, and they go with more the group mentality. So I think starting from that point of understanding that Korea is different, there are going to be different ways of how we look at life and look at each other and look at different things and situations, I think that is a good starting point, because then it could sort of give you the right expectations when it comes to, or I should say more realistic expectations when it comes to understanding the culture. Because if you have a certain expectation of, oh, Korean people will look at certain situations the same way that we do, you'll be probably pleasantly surprised that may not be the case. And that can sort of...
We hope pleasantly surprised.
Yeah,
We
hopefully.
hope not disappointed or shocked or annoyed
Right.
or resentful. Because it's something that I wanted to point out when it comes to these frameworks. We talk about these cultural worldviews and frameworks very easily. We just, throw out the word and just say like, oh, well, think about this concept, think about this kind of way of looking at life. But the fact of the matter is it's very, very, very difficult to step outside your own framework to be able to look at yourself from a third person perspective and say, oh, because of these cultural or way of upbringing or the people around me, oh, I have thought this way for so long. Now I'm forced to confront the fact that people don't think the way that I do. And if it's the first time that you're coming head to head with this realization, it can be very, very jarring because it is so, I think, symbiotic with society and upbringing, these worldviews, that you might feel almost like, oh, they are wrong.
Right.
As opposed to, no, this is just a worldview that I've been brought up to think in. So you gotta, I think, it's kind of touching into some, gray area, which still there's a lot of, discourse about, of saying this culture is wrong and mine is right. We're not saying it's in this way, but it is important to be able to acknowledge that there are going to be some differences that you might have thought was the baseline of what is right and wrong.
Right.
When that is just a different way of thinking.
Yeah, and even us being half Koreans, and I can speak for Becky, I'm sure, but even us growing up in a household where we had American fathers, but Korean mothers who celebrated Korean culture in their own way, even us moving to Korea, I mean, there are still culture shocks, and we made videos about it before, definitely check it out, where we talked about some of the culture shocks that we even experienced as half Koreans, having been exposed to Korean culture, but in America. And so how much more people who have never been exposed to Korea, to have this sort of shock factor. So yeah, I think that is the starting point, because then you'll be able to approach, I guess, a different culture. It doesn't even have to be Korea, any culture. You could approach different culture or even subcultures, and you can have more of an open mind. Because the thing is, there's not one way to look at life. There's not one perfect ideology politically, or, how a country works, right? There just isn't. But we tend to gravitate towards the familiar and what we're used to and what we're used to growing up in. So I think that is sort of the foundation when it comes to approaching this topic.
Yeah, and I think if you have that mindset already, it's going to help maybe prevent making snap judgments or even subconscious judgments about people. Somebody that I talked to, we were talking about this, these cultural differences and acceptance, and she made a very simple statement. It was basically, just because it's different doesn't make it weird. Because there's a difference between saying, oh, it's different versus it's weird. Once it's weird in your mind, it's a judgment. And then that creates some distance between you and this individual that you think is weird. So if you're able to understand, hey, this is different, that doesn't mean it's weird.
Right. So with that in mind, another piece of insight or advice, I don't want it to come across like this is advice, but another thing that I would like to offer is, if you're a complete non-Korean or a foreigner, however you want to call it, and you want to come to Korea, another thing that is super important is to study the culture, to try to understand the culture, and not from your own way of looking at life. Again, this goes back to the first point we made, but just like try to understand how the culture works from the other perspective, you know what I mean? So example of that could be language. It could be understanding food. And I would even go deeper to say that if you really want to understand any culture that's different than yours, one of the best things to do is to study the history. the history of Korea in this context, because if you study like Korean history in a sense, and I don't mean like you got to be a scholar, I mean like just having a general understanding of maybe how Korea was a couple hundred years ago and how it had different dynasties, and then how Korea totally changed in the mid 1900s after World War II, and Korea became really divided between North and South. Like if you have a general idea of how all of those events took place, then you'll have a better idea of how people think and why people think the way they do, and why maybe certain things are part of the culture the way it is.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Finish
go ahead.
your sentence.
No, that was it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I just wanted to add on top of that, almost a caveat. And this, I think we know pretty well when we look at history and who has written history, especially, say, in the United States. So we know that history can be written from a skewed perspective, depending on who is writing it. So if we consider the fact, like in Korea, in the US, when people talk about the Korean War, many times it's even called just the Forgotten War, because from the American perspective, it was not significant.
That's a good point.
It wasn't impactful on US history. So what's important about Korea, right? Because it didn't affect us in the States. But if you come to Korea, how this was such a major historical turning point and completely changed, everything. And so depending on where you're getting your research from, who's teaching you this history, it's also going to change your mindset about the people that you're trying to understand. So that's just something I wanted to bring up, because she specifically mentioned her students, African-American students in Chicago. And I think when we're talking about history, this is very, very vital to point out, where are you getting your resources from? So, but this goes hand in hand with language learning, right?
Yeah.
Because Korean history, especially the original sources, are probably going to be in Korean. So it is a long time journey whenever you're trying to understand any history or culture or people. It is a lifelong task and challenge, of course.
Right.
So that goes hand in hand, like, oh, you really want to understand? It's not just about associating with people and making friends, why language is important. It's also so that you can really read and really study and really understand.
Sure. And we're not saying it's an absolute requirement to enjoy or appreciate Korean culture to understand and study the history. I mean, I would imagine that even a lot of Korean people may not know the full scope of history, or maybe they, sort of forgot, because
you can still love and appreciate something, even if you don't, speak the language or know 100%.
Right. Yeah. But, I think it's only going to benefit you in terms of understanding the people, the culture, which will, and I don't want to get, too far ahead of the conversation, which will allow, I think, more room for you to be embraced by the people of Korea. But we'll get there in a second. Yeah. So, I think that is very important. Definitely studying the culture and the history and understanding why, just understanding even the stupidest little things, like why, I don't know, ajishis are in the subway, or like some of the older maybe Korean men like tend to yell, in the subway randomly, or they're hotheads, or you know what I mean? When you understand a little bit more about maybe they're this way because of this, and this, and because what they went through, blah, 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 then it gives you a little bit more of an understanding, and you don't get offended at every little thing. I'll be honest, and this is beyond the scope of today's conversation. We'll talk about it on the podcast for sure, but even me today, I tend to get offended from time to time by maybe something that a Korean person says, even though I'm half Korean, but like, or maybe just how I'm being treated in a sense of maybe they're treating me like a foreigner or something like that. On one hand, yes, I'm sort of justified in how I feel, but on the other hand, it's like, I understand why they're doing that. I understand why they say that. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I understand it. So then I can take a step back and be like, okay, this is why this person did this. This is why I'm always getting the whole, oh, you speak Korean really well. If you understand the history and you understand the culture, then you could better understand why foreigners, whenever they say 안녕하세요, which is basically hello, whenever they say that, like a Korean person will say, oh, you speak Korean so well, or do you know how to speak Korean? Like you would understand better, I think, if you just understand the history and the fact that, like I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but the fact that, Korea has been a nation to itself and hasn't been a nation of foreigners or having people that are, I guess, non-Korean for a long time. I mean, it's just really opened up in the past couple of decades, really, for, I guess, foreigners in the country to be normalized. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't want to
Yeah.
get too deep into that, but hopefully you get the point. Yeah. So what are some other ways that you feel like can help a non-Korean to come to Korea and to live and work and to navigate society?
Well, I would say it is split down into maybe 2 layers. This is how I kind of view it. And I'm in particularly speaking about non-Korean people, right? So I think you have this narrow concept of how to navigate Korean society, the Korean cultural ins and outs, language and culture, etc. But I think it is on a bigger scale that works anywhere with every people. Think about, how do I want to be related to? So for example, you think, oh, I would want to talk to somebody who is friendly, and I generally feel like they're interested in me, and I really think that, oh, they're not trying to cause any harm with me. If you create this kind of rapport, which you can do with anybody, anyone in the world, anywhere you go with any language, then already it puts you in a position of getting to be closer with somebody, regardless of their cultural background, regardless of their language or their race, right? So I think if we come already thinking of ourselves, because she mentioned again, global citizens, I think this is a vital characteristic of global citizens, to realize that, oh, well, actually as a human relating to a human, it is on a greater level than just language, culture, and skin color.
That's so good.
So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all humans and we all have this same sort of innate desire for communication. Connect. Yeah. And connect and relationship, for sure. So those are all good. I mean, a couple of other things that I think would be helpful is, obviously studying the language. I don't want to harp on it too much, but that goes without saying. Korea's national language is Korean. And
there's no other language.
There is no.
I mean, maybe
other
on
language.
Jeju-do, the
Right.
dialect is very different.
I mean, because you can go to Canada and English is sort of the main language, but you also have French as sort of like the secondary language and probably heavily spoken in certain parts of Canada. Korea is just Korean, right? No other Asian language. We don't speak Chinese here. We don't speak Japanese. But I think if you learn the language, then that will help you to understand a lot of the nuances of society, and because a lot of the culture is built into the language. So that goes without saying, I think, but I need to say it because a lot of people, and I can even put myself in this boat too. Like, I'm not free and clear of this, but a lot of people get too comfortable. When I say people, I mean like foreigners who are maybe English speakers. They get very comfortable with just navigating and living here and working here just by speaking English. Because you can actually get around in many parts of Korea, especially in the cities, just by English. So I think if you don't have that entitlement mentality, like, oh, I'm entitled to speak English here, I think you're better off wanting to, immerse yourself in the language learning so that you can not only like navigate society the way it was meant to be navigated, but you can also connect with people better.
Yes. You want to swim with the fishes together. But
with the fish.
Instead of being just the random fish over there that's like, just because I can swim faster and over here, doesn't mean you should. Right?
Right. That's very true.
Swim with the fishes.
That's very true.
You'll make fish friends.
Very true. Yeah. Man, I realize we can make this conversation probably hours long. But
Did you want to talk about entertainment?
Yeah. Let's talk about entertainment.
Okay.
A word of caution to many people who, because Korean entertainment, K-pop, K-dramas, has become very globalized in the past decade, especially. I think a lot of people can sort of have this misconception that this is how Korea is. This is Korean culture. This represents Korea. And like, I will go to Korea, live in Korea, and then I would meet my K-drama oppa who is so romantic and so sweet and looks perfect with perfect skin, perfect hair and everything. Don't get me wrong, you'll find them, but I mean, that's not the norm, right? So I think managing your expectations with that, like, don't allow that to be your expectation of Korea.
Let's get some perspective here. When you went to high school, was it Mean Girls personified?
Oh.
When you went to high school, did you have a gym teacher, that was teaching you sex ed? And did you have, crazy
Actually, I
girls
did.
attacking each other? What?
Yeah, my gym teacher.
He
in
did?
6th or 7th grade. Yeah.
Oh, he told you that if you do it, you'll die.
No, but he did teach sex ed.
Oh, that's funny. At least someone did. That's good. But think about it. We have already the Hollywood perception of what they think high school should look like, what life in the US is going to look like. This is what it is working in the ER. This is what it is to be a police officer in CSI, right? We know those are not fake or not real. Then why do we come to Korea thinking what is portrayed on the TV and the dramas or the movies is going to be reflective of the actual society?
Right.
So just have a little perspective.
Yeah, it's common sense, I guess. But, sometimes we can get lost in the
Because
entertainment.
if that's all you're ever exposed to, it's easy to associate, this is
Right.
Korean, because this is the only Korean thing that you've seen.
Sure. And that's understandable if you do that. But what we're saying is we're going to save you a lot of heartache and disappointment if we just put it up front. Just don't let that be your expectation.
You're not
going to
find that many those oppas everywhere.
Yeah. Unfortunately, ladies.
You'll find this kind instead.
There's not many of me running
That's
around
right.
either.
There's only one. And I got him. So
Yes. Yes. Another thing that I want to mention, and this is going to sound harsh, but it's not as bad as it sounds, is if you come to live and work in Korea or visit as a complete non-Korean, you will always, 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 always be viewed as a foreigner.
Well, can I dispute this?
Yes.
Again, this is the one in the millions. But apparently in the 1800s, there was a Dutch sailor guy who came here. He ended up marrying a Korean lady. And then he also ended up being a very well-known politician in Korea. And he had a Korean name and everything. So he was Korean.
That's a very, very uncommon one-off situation from over 100 years ago.
Yes.
But I mean,
But it
hey, that proves
happened.
your point. Yeah.
Okay, but you're right. For the most, you're right. 99.99.
Right. So again, this goes back, everything goes back to history and understanding the culture. But this is the framework that Korea views life from. If you're not ethnically Korean, you're going to be viewed as a 외국인. You're going to be viewed as a outside person.
Country person.
Yes. So, and it's not a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if you're sensitive to that and you're I want to be Korean, or you get all these plastic surgeries to become Korean and you're
not talking about anyone in particular.
Nah.
No.
But, it's just how Koreans view people generally, the culture, right? Because there's a distinction, just because, and there are foreigners who can actually get nationalized into citizenship. But even then, you could speak the language, you could have lived here for 20, 30 years, but in the minds of Korean people, because of the framework that they operate out of, they're still maybe they are Korean naturalized, but they're still foreigners.
Because there's a concept of ethnicity is equating to citizenship, right? Not vice versa.
Right. Yeah. And that's I'm sure that happens in a lot of countries, but that's not what we're used to in America. In America, theory.
Honestly, the US is a very unusual case.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. But, that's what we're used to, right? And a lot of you guys out there who are listening or watching, you guys live in America. You can be naturalized into citizenship and you are considered American because America is an immigrant nation, whereas Korea is not.
Right.
So there's the difference there. But don't let that offend you. Even I struggle with that, and I'm sure Becky does too, to a certain extent of even though we're half Koreans and we're living in Korea, we're still looked at as foreigners and treated as it most of the time.
It is a little bit different.
A little different,
though.
of course.
But we also face this.
Yes. So if you don't let that offend you and you come from a place of understanding, then you'll have a better time interacting with people, and you won't get all you won't think that people are throwing shade, because a lot of times, even Korean people look at foreigners in a positive light. Not all foreigners, don't get me wrong. Let me keep it real. But there's certain people that, even though they call them foreigners, they look up to them, or they respect them. So it's not a matter of respect or disrespect many times. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Good one.
Yeah. So do you have any other thoughts regarding living, working, or visiting Korea for a complete non-Korean?
Okay. This looks like 10 steps to having a good life in Korea. I think something that's very keen, and again, it just comes down to personally checking yourself. Having this understanding, I think, will help to lead to a more compassionate understanding and less resentment, maybe to wrongs that are done against you unintentionally. And also something that is very, very important, I think, is a sense of entitlement, which purely comes from, if we're speaking to people in the States, the fact that you are from the States. There is nothing that sets you apart or makes you better than any Korean person that you might be working with. Just because they don't speak English doesn't make you smarter per se. Just because they don't work on the American business mindset, it doesn't make you a better business person, right? And so making sure that you understand that simply having these certain, I don't know, characteristics granted to you that other parts of the world might view as more powerful or more intelligent or more educated or more, rich, it doesn't necessarily give you yourself a greater value than that person that you're interacting with. So I think, and long story short, don't be entitled.
Yeah.
Get rid of that entitled mindset. And we see this a lot because English, for example, was and still is very prized as a symbol of high education. Right? If you speak English well, it's going to open doors to you, which maybe equates to more successful, which maybe equates to more valuable, better person, which is not true. Of course not. It's simply a quality that you might carry innately coming from the States. So being able to recognize that and be like, whoa, okay, let me check myself. Do I actually think I'm better than you just because you don't speak English well in this business? It's not true. So getting rid of that self-entitled mentality, I think, is very key anywhere in the world.
We're talking to you, whoever that applies to.
Yeah, you, Dan, sitting in the back of the seat in the class, trying not to watch this video. Listen to your teacher.
We know what Dan. He probably thinks you're talking.
Sorry,
to him.
Dan. I'm not talking about you, Dan.
Yeah. So just don't be entitled, man. Like, you're no better. Look, real talk. And I know people are gonna disagree, and there's gonna be like stupid comments because there's always stupid comments of people like feeling like they're better than other people. But you're no better than the next person. I don't care where you're from. I don't care what your experiences are. I don't care how much money you have. You're no better than the next person. So as long as you keep that in check, then you'll have a much better time interacting with people.
Anywhere. Yeah.
Anywhere.
Literally
I don't
anywhere.
care where it is.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of the question. And in an effort to not make this super long, let's just briefly touch on the second part of that comment, which was, how can I increase the likelihood of Korean people embracing me or accepting me?
It goes hand in hand.
It does. It really does. I think a couple of practical things, in addition to everything that we already mentioned, is I think what's helpful is if you learn the language and you're able to get to a point where you can communicate with them, them being Korean people. It's not totally required. There are a lot of Korean people who actually speak good enough English to be able to communicate with you, even though Korean people generally feel like their English is not good, even though it's far better than what, many foreigners' Koreans level is. But I think if you learn the language, and it'll take time, you get to a point where you can communicate in the language of the country that you're in, that's going to bring down the walls a lot quicker because they'll immediately feel a lot more comfortable with you because they can communicate with you. There isn't this barrier of like, oh, I can't speak English, I'm going to shut down.
This is kind of related, but to see a good example of that in work, watch the Conan O'Brien Visits Haiti videos where he's addressing a group, an angry group, about some things that had come out of the American government, speaking about Haiti, and he addresses the people, even though they have a translator, he addresses them in his broken Haitian, and it totally eliminates that anger. It dissipates the sense of barrier because language carries that nuanced, innate emotions.
Sure.
And so just having that access to language will certainly open many hearts.
Right. And listen, if you're only visiting, you're here for a couple of weeks, just learn survival Korean.
On the plane.
Learn your survival Korean and, try your best to speak Korean. I think that can go a long way as well. But in terms of being accepted, look, everyone's not going to like you, or everyone's not going to embrace you. Just like in anywhere, you know what I mean?
Right.
Unless you're in a super friendly country, in America, in the South, we used to say like hi to like strangers in the grocery store or something like that.
That always made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is a little weird to me now, but like, you know, when I moved to New Jersey, New York City, you know, people mind their own. You know, you don't do that. So it's just sort of like a cultural thing. And same thing here. Like, you're not gonna like, no one's gonna greet you down the street unless they know you.
Well, I don't know. It just depends where you are.
Oh yeah.
And depends on what you're doing. When you go hiking, everybody always says hi when you pass
really?
each other.
I don't have that
안녕하세요.
experience.
네, 안녕하세요.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I guess it does depend, but yeah, I think if you come with a sense of respect and you respect people, people can sense that, even if you're not perfect in communicating. That can go a long way, and then you can eventually find people who are open to you. Because I think generally, Korean people, though sometimes they can come off as like standoffish or mean at times, I think generally Korean people are like more on the meek side, more on the softer side. Even when you have that ajashi who's like yelling in the subway and he's angry, he's hot-headed, there's still a soft side to
everyone
a lot
has
of
a
them.
soft
You know
side.
what I mean? So I think if you respect them, and if you're living here, you just give it time to make those relationships. They're gonna embrace you, I think.
Yeah, and you know, this is partly up to you. We know that making friends can't be easy when you're a newcomer, even if that means going to a new school or a new neighborhood. I think I experienced many times in my life. Being the new person is never easy because you're just trying to figure out what's the social networking here. What's the community like? Where do I fit in? How can I fit in? Who can I connect with? And so when you have additional barriers like cultural differences and language, and maybe looking different, those are all things that you're just gonna have to work with and overcome. And eventually you're going to meet individuals who are very curious about you or who have a very similar mind to you, even if they speak a different language. It's just a matter of people meeting people. And so that's kind of up to you in that case. How far forward am I going to push myself? You can only become friends with someone if you become a friend first.
Yeah, so hopefully all of that made sense, and everyone listening got some sort of value out of this conversation. And again, it's just coming from our perspective, but we think that this could be helpful for anyone who's interested in living in Korea as a non-Korean. And yeah, we think overall you'll have a good experience as long as you have a couple of key things that we talked about in your mind.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening to the Other Half of It podcast. If you have not subscribed anywhere you get your podcasts, or you're watching on YouTube, haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button or subscribe anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you're able to rate the podcast wherever you consume it, we definitely appreciate it. Just let us know. Let us know your thoughts, and we would definitely appreciate it. It'll really help us, keep us motivated to keep creating. So anyways, we'll see you in the next podcast episode. Everyone stay safe and peace.